The biased press are working overtime to share a disinformation campaign to deflect from the fact that the Secretary of State, legislature, and governor disenfranchised every Idaho voter.
Okay, so that is part of a video released yesterday by Idaho GOP Chairwoman Dorothy Moon, trying to combat all the pushback from the decision made at the party's general meeting last month about bringing back a Republican presidential caucus next year instead of a primary. The thing is, though, it isn't what she calls the biased press claiming they are disenfranchising voters. It's coming from inside the House, members of her own party.
A caucus then gives you the ability to once again control the decisions of hundreds of thousands of Republicans, and it's made by a smaller group. What we know from other states doing this is you have 10 to 15% participation rather than, over 50% participation when you have a primary.
So not only are members of her own party claiming this is true, it's also members of her own party who put themselves in this position. The majority party voting last session to eliminate the March election and move any presidential primary to May. And in the chairwoman's opinion, that takes Idaho out of any sort of valuable participation in picking a Republican president. Well, this seems like a good time to bring in chief political reporter Joe Paris to explain kind of how we got to this position.
Yes, and all of this goes back to the legislature, as so many things do, but yes, and this goes back to legislations that was actually passed earlier this year, and you may remember that lawmakers approved and the governor signed a new law that aimed to combine the March presidential primary election with the May state primary. And a technical error with the new law inadvertently eliminated the presidential primary altogether. So a trailer bill was whipped up to get things back on track at the end of the legislative session. However, it died an untimely death in the House State Affairs Committee. So it's up to the parties, Democrats, Republicans, to create their own nomination process. GOP Chair Dorothy Moon announced what Republicans are planning on doing, a firehouse caucus on March 2nd, 2024. That is, caucuses all around the state of Idaho. And a caucus, if you're unfamiliar, it involves people physically getting together in a group and separating into smaller groups based on candidate preference or undecided. From there, speeches, arguments, debates go down to convince people to pick a candidate, and the group with the most people, they win. And a lot of times this happens in like a high school gymnasium. It may not be the best option, but the GOP says it's their only one at this point, a blame that Chair Moon placed firmly on state leaders.
Idaho's Secretary of State introduced legislation to move Idaho's presidential primary from March to May. The bill he introduced and the legislature passed and the governor signed failed to include language that would move our presidential primary to May. Instead, removing the presidential primary completely.
So some context is needed here, and I mentioned that there was legislation that would have fixed everything to allow for a presidential primary in May. Well, Chair Moon testified against that in committee, saying that she had no input as party chair.
I represent the party of Idaho here in Idaho, and I'm very concerned that the primary stakeholder on this issue was never consulted. Now, I did speak to the Secretary of State on January 2nd at an Ada County meeting, and he was under the impression that I was supportive of it, and I said no. In fact, I was wanting to move the primary up into February so we could be the Iowa of the West.
The Secretary of State tells me, by the way, he spoke with Chair Moon several times after January, but anyways, that legislation died in a weird way. Watch the end of this meeting.
Senate Bill 1186 is properly before the committee. Senate Bill 1186 dies for a lack of a motion.
Sorry.
Already made my decision.
So it does happen, but if you've seen that happen, it is very rare. So what is this all about anyways? Well, Chair Moon says it's about making Idaho front and center of the presidential nomination process. They think a March caucus is better than waiting for a May primary if lawmakers allow that option.
Keeping the Idaho GOP's presidential nomination process in March will incentivize national candidates to campaign in Idaho, learn and debate issues important to Idaho, and appeal directly to the Idaho voters to advance the interest of our state, including our industries, job creators and employers. The Idaho GOP must remain in the front of the presidential nominating process.
Voting is crucial, and having candidates visit Idaho would be great. The truth is, though, it is very unlikely for major presidential candidates from the GOP to visit Idaho for an extended amount of time. Maybe a quick fundraising stop like we'd seen in the past. But with only a couple dozen delegates for the Republican convention, and candidates know their time is used better in other places, coming to Idaho, well, it's a decision you have to make. For perspective, though, on the change, primary to caucuses, I spoke with Boise State politics expert Dr. Stephanie Witt, and she highlighted the practical challenges of having a caucus. Maybe some of you have memories of the 2016 Democratic caucus downtown where there was a lot of chaos.
I think there's no question that this reduces turnout significantly. You have to be available on that evening and for a long time, and whether it's a work schedule or childcare, other things that get in the way of people being able to take that much time to come down and participate whittles the number of participants significantly.
For example, in 2012, only 1 in 10 Republicans in the state of Idaho even went to the caucus. Meanwhile, I spoke with Idaho Democratic Party, and they are calling on the Idaho legislature to reinstate the presidential primary election. And I've spoken with plenty of Republicans, too, and there are some calls for a special session later this year. But, Brian, the legislation, when it died in committee because of a lack of motion, it was a weird ending. But when you think back to that meeting as a whole, there's competing ideas. Of course, when you talk about having the May presidential primary, well, that's not what portion of the Republican Party wants. They want it even earlier in the year. Right. Dorothy Moon even mentioning she wanted it in February. So now you're going to have this battle between those that say, okay, we want to have this in May and we want to do it the primary way, or you have folks that are going to say, no, we have to do it earlier in the year for X, Y, and Z, but it has to be a caucus because of the way things are set up.
So bottom line is there was a mistake when trying to remove local school elections from March. There was a mistake in that bill. They had a chance to fix it. They didn't. Now we're going to say we're going to try to add a caucus, which limits the voters, because again, 1 in 10 is the history that shows up for these caucuses.
And the caucus and the primaries is very different. The caucus has an opportunity for conversations, exchanging of ideas, people being swayed. Primaries, you go in and vote, so you can make arguments for both sides. I do want to mention, I spoke with Secretary McGrain today over the phone, and he told me that his office, he and himself, they're pushing to have a primary. They really like the primary over the caucus. We will see, though, where this goes. Will there be a special session? We'll find out. I've heard, though, that lawmakers are ready to hit the ground running in January to come up with a solution.
They only have 3 months to do it. All right, thanks, Joe.